legend in the aviation industry. One of the most humble people you'll ever meet. And if I unfortunately have to say so, Johann, an overachiever. He has done so much for the industry. He's the founding member of Henley Air. And if you have coffee with him one day, let him tell you the story how Henley Air was started. And I think it had something to do with Pick n Pay and Superman, or Spider-Man. It is an intriguing story. Johann Coetzee matriculated in 1964. In 1968, he completed a BA Admin degree through the University of the Free State. He holds 3 PhD degrees. His areas of expertise: the organization, psychology and wellness, the executive assessment and counseling, ethics, and aviation psychology. He himself was a student of Bas Bezuidenhout. I think it started in 1981, Wim Johann. What a wonderful story. He loves sport. He has completed the Comrades Marathon. He's got a Silver Cross for life-saving. He played Free State Provincial, or he achieved Free State Provincial colours in rugby, swimming and water polo. He has helped the likes of many pilots in the last 30 years. He's been intricately involved with SAA when Uncle Bruce, William Rooken Smith and the likes were still there in terms of managing pilots' wellness. He assists to this day in helping us and the industry improve better levels of safety. It gives me great pleasure to introduce Johann Coetzee.
I trust you all got a copy of your homework. Ladies and gentlemen, as a concluding perspective this afternoon, I'm not going to lecture to you or at you, but merely refer you to the area or the zone from here upwards. And you will note the topic of the discussion, or the particular title, which is the MMPI that we all should consider, the mandatory periodic mental inspection. And may I start by saying that if you have the courage and the introspection integrity to volunteer your own condition because only you know, then you're an aviation hero. But if you disguise something that's pathological within your own domain, then you're an aviation coward, which I have been in my own life. I'm sure that you will agree that very often honesty in aviation is career limiting. And can I take you please to page, let me find it, page 3 of our document, and we're going to work through this together this afternoon. And I'm referring to your medical checkup, which is a statutory prescription. We have to do it as pilots. Pardon me. And I've taken this actual copy, this is authentic, from the checklist that your medical practitioner, your aviation medical practitioner, will in fact ask you to complete or respond to. And there's a preamble to it which I also have to share with you, and that relates to the following. About 35 years ago, we started our campaign in South Africa to try to get mental health into the medical checkup and to complete the fit to fly paragon in a way that we can certify that people are in fact okay. But there's a paradox in it. Don't you find it interesting that we pay far more attention to the quality of the aircraft next door when the AMO signs it off than human beings, and yet the entire discussion today was about human beings, the human factor. We pay very little attention to the holistic health of ourselves when we sit in front of that medical practitioner, and I'm not knocking them. We're preoccupied with cardiovascular quality. Jou hart moet net nie gaan staan nie. But it's interesting, if you need a heart, you can buy one. But where do you buy an attitude? And where do you purchase integrity and openness? Can I take you just through a few of these questions to create some discomfort within yourself? You're sitting in front, let's simulate it, in front of your medical practitioner, and they have to tick these boxes. And I'm just going to run through a few, obviously. The first topic is about depression. Now, I'm at risk of saying, but I'll risk it nevertheless, that everyone sitting in this Hangar auditorium here today is experiencing some degree of depression. It's only the degree that varies. So the questions are, for example, during the past 3 months, have you often been bothered by feeling down, depressed, or hopeless? And I would suggest to you that not one of you would say yes when you're doing your medical, even though you might be depressed even as you meet that medical practitioner. Secondly, during the past 3 months, have you often been bothered by having a little interest or pleasure in doing things? My goodness, all the chores in my domestic environment would constitute yes. I will never risk a yes. Point 4, in the past 3 months, has there been a marked elevation in your mood lasting for more than 1 week? Well, you should say, phone my wife. And obviously you'll say no. Can we go to about anxiety attacks? In the past 3 months, have you had an episode of feeling sudden anxiety, fearfulness, or uneasiness? And the honest answer is, of course. Secondly, in the past 3 months, note the 3 months, have you experienced sensations of shortness of breath, palpitations, facing a heartbeat, or skating or shaking while at rest without reasonable cause? Absolutely. In the past year, have you needed to seek urgent medical advice because of an anxiety? And even if I had, I wouldn't volunteer that. Let's go to a precarious area called alcohol use. It should be abuse. You're still sitting in front of the room, in the rooms of the doctor. Have you ever felt that you should cut down on your drinking? Have people annoyed you by criticizing your drinking? Have you observed at an air show the evening before, guys having a very good time and flying at 8 o'clock the next morning and flicking in 14 times? Met 5 biere agter die blad. I count them because we're on duty at air shows. Have you ever felt guilty about your drinking, or call it excessive drinking? Point 4, have you ever needed a drink first thing in the morning? And can we then just go to drug abuse? Have you used drugs other than those required for medical reason? And the question is, like what? Which non-prescription, over-the-counter drugs have you used? And when last did you use such drugs? I put it to you, ladies and gentlemen, that this questionnaire, which is a statutory document and to which we're all subjected when we do the so-called medical by a general practitioner, and again, let me preempt what I'm saying, we're not knocking these people at all. This is an attempt at least. But 35 years later, by virtue of this checklist, we're actually precipitating unsafe flying. We cannot do this. This is unfair. So may I invite you into my rooms for a brief moment as we just share a few thoughts. Madam, you're 44 years old, you're in the pre-climacteric, you're menopausal. Can we talk about premenstrual tension and its effect on your irrationality? It's invasive, you might even throw the Poppy Act in there. But instead of going through checklists at an interface encounter, caringly, embracively saying to people, your age suggests we need to talk more about fundamentals here. Sir, 37% of all men have a prostate condition of some kind. When last did you do the digital check of your prostate, not just your PSA? Sir, you're often away on protracted assignments like 4 days, 5 days, or weeks. Can we talk about your libido, your sex drive? And have you tested your testosterone, as a matter of fact? And I'm not saying that you've had extramarital relationships, etc., but this is a place that's non-punitive and we don't disclose. Maar dalk kort jy hulp. Or is that too invasive? What does absolute mental okayness, if I may use the vernacular, actually constitute? And the point that I would risk making is, why would you not consider attempting to go through some of those pointers and ask yourself, and if it's crude, let me say it nevertheless, that you've lied yourself into the extension of your flying. I've added, for your own benefit, a document which says self-regulation. And it has, I think, 23 points with it. And I'm obviously not going to go through that today. That would just be too exhaustive, and I'm sure you want to get home and watch some rugby. But those 23 pointers, I would suggest, is a self-inflicted encounter which may just be useful for you to consider. And there is a preemptive comment that goes with this. The best psychologist or psychiatrist or medical practitioner or life coach or whatever you might call such a professional is in fact yourself. The word psychology in fact constitutes a threat to people. They'll catch me out, or they'll see something. Or, you know, there is a connotation of madness, as it were, groendakkiestal. But perhaps with an instrument, with a checklist, a pre-flight of this kind, it might just preempt with you, stimulate an introspective honesty that could save your own life and the life of others. When I flew a bit and badly, I realized and wrote a little bit about it that when you're solo in that cockpit, you're actually in an ICU. It's an intensive care unit. It's you alone. And it's about you and your construct here, which none of us here understand fully. But the first 2 pages, I'd like to just isolate a couple of pointers, and then I'm through, and I promise. If we sublimate the CAA prescription, and we've tried this all over the world, believe me, then in fact we're succumbing to something that is inadequate. And we may well say, coming through our medical, and whether it's about our audiology or our cardiology or our pulmonology, which are the 3 zones that are typically thoroughly checked, what are you leaving out deliberately? What are you concealing? And where do you go to, in fact, have that thoroughness assessed? I shared with Terry earlier today that I'll rather lose you as a friend than lose you as a pilot. I will assist to have you grounded so that you can fly again, other than to conform to your own dishonesty and die. And we all know that aviation is not the quest for zero defect, it is zero defect. If you lie, you die. And sadly, we've been to too many of those funerals in our lives. We've got to enhance honesty to enhance safety. And that starts and ends with ourselves. So may I invite you into my rooms, as it were, for a few moments, ladies and gentlemen, and ask you to bear with me. If you'd care to go to a few MMPI moments in the ICU, it's in your document. And I promise that I won't use all of them. I'll be a few minutes and then we go home. The first point I referred to just briefly, and that is, why do we pay more attention to the condition of the aircraft than the complete condition of the pilot? And in order to assist you, if you agree with that statement, as arbitrary as it might be, why don't you use that self-regulation checklist which I've attached? And the reason why I've attached it is it not only worked, but it continues to work with honest pilots. And I just want to expand there for a minute. The greatest positive attitude you can have in the direction of holistic wellness is volunteerism. That's where you actually announce that there's something within you that worries you, that's troublesome, and that actually constitutes a danger zone for you. And in his absence, I will use his name because he's a hero, and that's Pierre Gous, who regularly calls me and says, "Kan ons koffie drink?" And I say, "Why?" And he'd say, "I don't know why, but perhaps it's useful. I just want to ensure that I'm actually okay." And then we would dig into the most intimate dimensions of his very being. The big word is your ontology, the essence of who you are. The greatest friend that you can have is somebody who knows everything about you and still likes you. That's the person who respects you. Find that individual. And if you need to, ignore the psychologist and other professionals, but find a buddy who will in fact not spare you what you ought to hear. Would you care to go just 4 down? The greatest aviator skill is humility. And I'll share an anecdote with you to prove the point. It was referred to today on 2 occasions that humbleness and humility is a virtue. The late Laurie Kay asked me to assist him with some work, and it referred to candidates of the late SA Express and SA and so on to be sent down to 43. And we would then meet with the successful candidates, and they would meet this doyen of South African aviation. And one particular lady asked him, "You've got 22,000 incident-free hours. What is your greatest skill?" And he immediately said, "Humility." And another girl picked up and said, "But skill is not a humility. It's an intrinsic attribute." And he said, "Make humility a skill." I also flew one night to Sydney, and he invited me into the jump seat, and I spent many hours there with him. And I said to him, "What are you busy doing right here, flying the 747? He said, "I'm busy respecting 2 things. And I asked, obviously, why. The first thing he said was, "I respect the fact that human beings built this thing. And secondly, I respect the courage and the arrogance of a human being flying it." Is it unfair to say, ladies and gentlemen, that when we fly those instruments that are parked out there, and whatever the instrument is that you do fly, that we're always at the cusp of something precarious? That aircraft is always slightly ahead of us. Are you ahead of yourself in terms of what you might be disguising in order to continue to fly? Would you care to go roughly halfway? You have to understand the basics of your own psychology and your own behavior. And people have asked, under the research we've done and trying to understand what our domain is all about, what are the fundamental characteristics that set us apart as aviators? What would they be? And of course, we've done factor analysis and all sorts of other things. And eventually we just said, hang on, let's just think this through by asking people. And there are 4 characteristics that matter. It's your analytical ability, your deductive reasoning, your mental alertness, and your situational savvy. And you can have all the hours in the world and 20 PhDs, but if you don't possess those 4, you're in trouble. And who's ever asked you not to reveal it, but to avail yourself so that it can be not assessed, but at least discussed? And I can say to you that in our Institute for Aviation Psychology, here at Henley Air, that's where we focus. But we add a 5th one in a very tentative sense, but nevertheless we do add it. And that is the whole issue of intuition, and that is gut feel. And I'll share an anecdote with you just to illustrate this point, which is very deep essentially. But we were at the National Aerobatics Championships at Syferfontein, Baragwanath, one year, and it was very competitive, and there was speculation about who the national champion would be. And guys lined up and they flew, and some of them sadly are not with us anymore. But then Brian Zederberg, and I'm sure many of you might remember the name, lined up in a Pitts S2, and he got the clearance to take off, and he didn't. He taxied back to the hangar. And I went up and I said to him, "Is something wrong?" And he said, "I'm not sure, but I don't feel I should fly." And he parked and got out, and that evening he got the President's Prize for Safety for not flying. If there's something within you that is a niggle which might suggest this flight is not on, ask yourself, what is on? And what is on is that introspective integrity which says, not now. That makes you the hero. The second one, last one on that first page, don't let your passion cause you harm. We may not be good at what we like. And I'm sure you've seen it in your own domains, and we've certainly seen it in Henley Air and in other places where we've also done some work, where we've also added a subtext to that point, and that is very often you find that very wealthy people allow their wealth to kill them. And that sounds very cruel and perhaps even crude. But if you can afford the aircraft and become irresponsible, like the weekend warriors who fly off to the game farm after 4 o'clock on a Friday, we shudder. And I'm sure that you've also heard the anecdote that so often people phone from the game farm and hy in die visdam geval voor die huis, because what he wanted to do was show off his equipment to the friends that he had in his palace over the weekend. If your passion doesn't in fact check with your integrity about your own precarious nature, then you're in very serious trouble. If you'd care to go with me to the second page, and I promise I'm almost through, and then we go home, if I can find it. Let me preempt it while I'm just paging through. The point that I am making, ladies and gentlemen, is just this. That the stethoscope that's required, the fundamental stethoscope that is required, is the one that you can operate. You're skilled at it. But do you have the courage and the introspective honesty to apply it? And at my own expense, I would say to you, and I will repeat, it is your conscience that is far more relevant in terms of practice and application than having 10 sessions with a psychologist that just wants to check the superficial protocol of what the book says. Top of the second page. What are you busy concealing that nobody has detected? Reveal it now. Because so often when you're alone and you're on a sortie where you're the single operator in that ICU, we don't have to declare, nobody will know. And if you have a condition, whatever it is, which nobody has detected, it can continue. But if it continues, it compounds, it gets worse. And it's interesting that very often dishonesty is also something that can endure until, God forbid, the worst happens. The third point on page 2, all pilots fear something when in the universal aviation domain. What is yours? Share an anecdote. It's asked by the chief pilot of an airline to have a chat to a particular captain on I think it was a 318 at the time. And the detail wasn't shared and it wasn't pertinent other than meet with this particular individual. To cut a very long story very short, he couldn't land at night in George. He feared flying there at night. So whenever he did his bids to fly, he always checked who was his first officer and who was better than him at night and George. So I saw him and he revealed that, and all credit to him. And I said to him, demote yourself. Go and sit in the right-hand seat and you'll be a hero. And he said, the system won't allow it. The outcome of that is not important, but the process is, where I had to share with him that sadly, if you actually conceal this and use energy to manipulate around a deficiency, it will extend to other domains of your life. Don't go there. He eventually demoted himself, and he's still flying out of the left-hand seat. Just go to the middle of the page. Instinct often overrides judgment. Remain in control of your sensory construct. And as much as we said, gut feel and instinct, your sensorial inclination, will obviously guide your behavior, your thinking. But bring a dimension into it as well, and that is your character. And that's your judgmental composure, which says that's right and that's wrong. We may well have a good personality and have an attitude that is appealing, and we have good relationships, and we're people of a convivial orientation, and we're nice to be with, etc. But how is your fundamental character about safety? There where you, in fact, adjudicate what's right and what is wrong, not only for yourself, but for everybody around you. And that's where we find lapses so often. And I'm not immune or not guilty about it. We all have been there. In the middle of the page, you note the 4 critical P's. The plane, the pilot, and the performance must synchronize as the 3 critical P's. And if that were true for most of us as we do that checklist, the one that's not prescribed, I think that synergy, ladies and gentlemen, is the one that should be uppermost on our own checklist. Talking of which, and it's the last point that you will notice, but I bring it in here. Do you have your own mantra of your own philosophy of flying, a pilot's philosophy? And incidentally, for me, philosophy is the science of wisdom. And if that science is in fact owned by yourself and respected by yourself, recorded for yourself, then I think you have got a very useful checklist. In simple language, what do you actually believe in when you're flying? There are 7 dimensions in life that define you, and I will expand on this last 2 before you find it irritating. Norms, values, principles, standards, ideology, religion, and faith. And yes, you'll say, leave the religion and faith thing. But if you believe the previous pilot did the checklist on the pre-flight, it's okay, then that is your religion. That's what you believe in. And what is the actual expanded version of those 7 ideological factors that constitute yourself at work, at the cyclic? Or do you not have it? If the AMO dictates that from next door, then I think you're one step away from something untoward. Third last point, if I may. Respect the impact of relational intrigue and emotional anguish on your judgment. And you may well say that is invasive, and I asked some pertinent questions just now. But imagine if you do have a questionable relationship at home, or a child that's wayward on drugs that worries you and costs you, or some relational intrigue which is in fact having such a profound impact on your normality and your functionality up here and up here, your emotive construct, it actually invades who you are and who you potentially can be. 2 minutes worth of technicalities. There are small adrenal nodes on your kidneys, and they secrete negative adrenaline. It's called noradrenaline. Here's the point. You fly an aircraft, it's going well, you're having a good time, and all of a sudden, something happens untoward. Immediately, your heart rate goes up, and your respiratory rate goes up, And instead of being 72, you're at 172. And instead of 19 inhalations, you're at 120. The point is, you're not functionally perfect. Something happened, something's untoward. But imagine leaving home in the morning and you don't leave it well. Or you are away on an assignment and you're not forgiven for the fact that you're missing your child's birthday. And there's nonsense coming from home in that regard. Perhaps it's not nonsense. Then that negative secretion on your kidneys is secreting poison. And you're constantly running at 100 and perhaps at 50. And that, in fact, makes you not fit to fly or to fly precariously. So you've got to find yourself in a world, in a situation, and in relationships that are conducive to your optimal flying skill and nothing else. We all have a serious condition, a social issue, every one of us sitting here, that you would never be prepared to share, but which does have a profound impact on your optimal functionality. That's human nature. That's who we are. Second last, and for me it's so important, never let pride compromise your competence. And you've got to know the nature of your egoic state. We all have an ego, it was said earlier today, but what is the actual impact of that ego? At the risk of being too close to the bone, let me nevertheless say this in the essence of what this day is all about. If you're in an air show, whether in a rotor wing or in an extra, whatever it is, if you're addicted to the crowd and the crowd's applause, you're already in dangerous territory. You'll put in one more flick or risk a sortie which is perhaps not quite within your skill domain. And your egoic state you need to understand. And if you don't, spend time with somebody who can share it with you. And if you're an exhibitionist beyond the context of your skill, your known skill to yourself, know why. Why would you risk beyond the parameters of who you actually are, but also who you're not? We've buried too many people who exceeded the limits of who they are, but who the audience dictated they ought to be. Let me finish with the last point. We all want to go home. If the science of wisdom is the philosophy that actually determines and defines who you are, may I suggest, at the risk of being prescriptive, that you spend a moment or two, some time, just on some of what's in here. The authors of everything I've shared with you this afternoon and what I send you home with is not me, it's aviators. They're the authors. All I did was hear it and condense it and reduce it to paper. Ultimately, dear friends, safety, whatever it is not mechanistic. It's not a seminar. It's not CRM. It's not passing something. It's not getting a stamp on a piece of paper that's licensed you to continue with you are. But it's an indelible stamp on your integrity and on your conscience. Thank you.
Baie dankie oom Johann. Baie insiggewend. Ladies and gentlemen, are there any questions that anybody would like to raise to either oom Johann or any of our speakers that are here? Taryn, well, the mic's on the way.
Hi, thanks. Of course, it's me that has a question. Prof. Coetzee, you know my husband, but we haven't met formally. I love this mandatory mental periodic inspection. It's really necessary, and I find myself I'm about a year into my overall at the moment. What I'd like to know is, you know our story personally, and we've walked through this route, and I've tried to keep it all legal and above board. What are the repercussions to answering these questions on the depression page? If you're sitting in front of a medical examiner, what actually does happen?
I'm not a medical practitioner, so I cannot speak on behalf of the medical fraternity whatsoever. But I would suggest that 100% of you will say to 100% of the questions no, because it's career limiting. The answer that I would risk is on the question you're not asking, and that is we've got to change that regime. That's what's happening. And I'll just answer you by virtue of the chief pilot of Singapore Airlines some years ago where we did some work. And we said, can we not please get into some honesty in terms of checking the stuff, we're discussing here? And he said, we absolutely agree. And some other airlines I'm not going to mention also said it's high time we must get in there and get it right, etc., but not now. And that's been the answer for 35 years. Not now. Because they said, how do you do it? How's it objective? What do you do with it? How do you detect it? How do you get people to reveal themselves absolutely? And the point that I wish to reiterate based on your very relevant question, and that is, let it be ticked for what it's worth when you're there, but be alert. But the one you need to tick is the one that's not present during that interface. And that is the one on integrity and conscience. Do your own. Do your own. It's inadequate. In fact, it's advancing the lack of safety. It's precipitating an unsafe culture in its present sense. And you can quote me. I'll go to jail for honesty.